Welcome back to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Joan Eakin, professor at the University of Toronto. So Joan, in the last segment, you were talking about the effects on workers and employers in that return to work process after a worker's hurt, and the stigma that's caused and some of the negative consequences. So we've been working together for close to 20 years, and we were trying to say, how can we use the research to make a difference in the lives of workers, to actually promote their health? And so we did some work together on that issue of stigma with the Workers' Compensation Board in Ontario. Some thoughts on that process and reflections?
The process of working with the WSIB, or the process of bringing the notion of stigma to workers? What were you thinking?
Well, oh my gosh, because they were all intertwined. I'm not sure which is which here now.
Well, the notion of stigma is a sociological one, and it really refers to a stain. If you have a physical stigma, where you have a stain on you, a birthmark or whatever, that's where the original concept comes from. And it refers really to a social stain, that somehow you are tarnished by something. And injured workers are tarnished in a very special way by the fact that they were injured at work. Much more so. I mean, comparing them even to veterans, the military, where they have been injured at work too. But the context in which the injured workers or injured military folk are regarded is very different from the context in which injured workers are regarded, even though the injury might be exactly the same.
We have the road of heroes,
right.
That people would cheer when they come back from Afghanistan.
Right. That's right. That's right.
And injured workers,
because they're
we don't even see them.
Military people it's more about service and nationalism and so on than about work. Whereas those who are injured at work are, first of all, invisible. To non-working class people, it's an invisible problem. They don't know who is there. And I certainly heard when I interviewed injured workers, they talked a lot about the problem of, I would never tell anyone that I've been injured. Being injured is a stigma at work, is a stigma that goes with you. So when you try to get another job, you don't want to let on that you're an injured worker, because maybe you're one of those kinds of guys that likes to, claim compensation. Again, the discourse of abuse comes into it. And so the stigma arises from imputations of a kind of moral nature about people who've been injured at work. At the very best, they've been careless and somehow, not worked carefully. At the worst, they're injured because they like being off work. They don't want to work. They don't like their work. So there's all these different kinds of stigma that are attached to injured workers. And so when you and I worked at the WSIB, we wanted to draw their attention to the way in which there is prejudice and stereotypes of injured workers operating. People don't articulate it. They don't even recognize it. An example is, I can remember working with a group at the WSIB who were trying to redesign their hiring, the forms that people had to hire, and they tried to, this is for adjudicators, and they tried to identify people who would make good adjudicators and so on. And so we were talking about these forms, and we were talking about adjudicators' behaviors, and I did another study of frontline WSIB workers, so that's where I found out some of these things. That they would, they make a distinction between employers and workers. And in very, very subtle ways, they have a different standard for employers. For example, they tended, once they framed employers, especially the smalls, which I was interested in, they would think of mom and pop operators. They're struggling. A business person, what are they meant to do? They're meant to try to make money. They're meant to run a business, right? They're meant to push envelopes to the edge, right? So it was okay for them to kind of push right to the edge of what they were allowed to do. And also, they gave them slack. It's tough being a small business person, which it is, but they tended to be more willing to give them slack not for injured workers. Injured workers were not allowed to push to the edge of the envelope. If they pushed for access to payment for drugs and taxis to a physiotherapy or whatever therapist, it was viewed as taking advantage of the system, that somehow they were asking for too much. It was just, again, part of this discourse of abuse, that they couldn't push the envelope to the edge. They couldn't ask for more. And so they, a matter of fact, if a worker came in with a representative, for example, that was viewed as a bit of a red flag. This is going to be one of those people. They're going to fight for their, right. They feel entitled was a way of
These
actually.
uppity workers.
Right. They feel entitled, which of course they are entitled, but it was not used that way. It was used as, as a more derogatory term, and workers were not given slack the same way that employers were. But when I spoke to WSIB staff about it, they had no idea that they made that kind of difference. They saw employers as people who paid, and the workers were the ones who cost the injured workers. So, I mean, what do you do in a structural situation like that when, one party it brings in is the revenue and one party is the cost? How do you not treat them differently? So that is really a way in which the structure also affected adjudicators are also workers, and their work and their attitude towards it all was framed by the organization they were in, and the different roles that employers and injured workers played in the organization, and you and I worked on several committees there to try and make people more aware of the stigma. And I encounter people all the time who will say, like say I'm in a taxi or something and I'm chatting and whatever, and it comes out that I work with injured workers, compensation. Oh yeah, those guys that, sitting at home watching TV. It's very widespread. So it's not just the WSIB.
Oh, yeah. It's everywhere.
And in fact, workers themselves participate in that discourse, because they would say to me, I'm not one of those guys that just wants to sit at home and watch TV. Which is true, but by saying that, they create the category of people who do want to sit at home. So they participate in that discourse. So we all are implicated in that discourse, and that is an important element underlying the stigma.
So Joan, I knew that I couldn't pack 20 years of, all the things I've learned from you into just a half an hour show, and we haven't. We've come to an end. I want to thank you so much for sharing a little bit of what you've learned along the way. And I want to encourage our viewers to turn into our Facebook page, where I'll post more information. And if you want to find out more about Joan or some of her research, please get in touch. We'll see you next week, and please stay safe.